Let's talk about Putinism. Why? For two reasons, really. First, Putinism is a form of politics that starts with a worldview that completely contradicts the world that's revealed through the gospel. And our worldview is what forms our ethics. Secondly, Putinism is a politics that's being exported from Russia in a way very similar to the way Russia, or rather the Soviet Union, once exported communism. So Americans ought to be concerned. So let's talk about it. What is it? Why is it a threat? Let's start by remembering a bit of our history. The Berlin Wall, the fall of the Berlin Wall was such an extraordinary moment. We can see it in our museums. It was a time when hope blossomed because at last the Cold War was over and democracy had won, liberal democracy had won, and then we felt certain it would spread to all of the nations that ultimately would arise from the disintegration of the old Soviet Union. And there was cause for hope that ultimately was realized, for many of those nations are now liberal democracies, are moving in that direction, have capitalism, and are actually our allies, and indeed part of NATO and the European Union. So our optimism was justified. But our hopes weren't justified, it turns out, for Russia. The seeds of democracy were planted there, but they failed to flourish. And we'll remember names like Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin, and then ultimately Vladimir Putin, all of whom were involved in the hope of establishing democracy in Russia, but involved in what ultimately gave way to a kleptocracy rather than a democracy. Kleptocracy is not a word we Americans use that often, though we ought to be familiar with it. We have another phrase we use for a period that was very similar to the one that ensued in Russia recently. The period of our robber barons, which, as you'll recall, was coincident with the establishment of our first Jim Crow period. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, Soviet Russia converted from communism to capitalism, or at least it tried. Under communism, all resources, all property was owned by the people. To move towards liberal democracy, to move towards capitalism, required that all of that property held by all the people be converted to private property. And as you can imagine, that created extraordinary opportunity for the powerful to reach and seize those resources and to become extraordinarily wealthy through the ownership of them. And that's exactly what happened. Only there was a great difference between what happened in Russia and what happened in 19th century America. Our grand expansion from sea to shining sea happened after we had established the liberal institutions and the rule of law that made those things possible in such a way that didn't threaten democracy. Russia did not have those liberal institutions. They did not have democratic rule. And so what resulted was not democracy, but the accumulation of great power by a small number of oligarchs who then, ever since, have ruled the country. So what Russia had in the 1990s and certainly in the beginning of the 21st century was not a liberal democracy in any sense, but a kleptocracy that had and continues to have a fig leaf of democratic rule through institutions that are democratic in name only. Some scholars believe that Vladimir Putin may be today the wealthiest person in the world. What we do know is that by 2012, he and his cronies had amassed such wealth and such inequality had arisen after the fall of the Berlin Wall that the people rose in protest, and Putin could no longer even fake being a democracy. He couldn't win an election in 2012. So what did he do? He stole it. How did he do that? By weaving a story of the Russian people and persuading people of its truth that casts Russia as the perpetual victim, as a victim in which the enemy is always at the gates, threatening the survival of the Russian people, wanting the Russian people's demise. And the enemy for Putin, who is always at the gates, is the West, and in particular, you and me, the United States, and our democracy. In a Putinist worldview, a nation doesn't progress towards a more prosperous future because it's always stuck in the present. There is no future, only the present, in which threats are always to be fended off. You may have some idea of what that's like if you've ever been through a divorce or a serious illness or strived to create a business by bootstrapping it. That sense that you can never make the progress that you would like because there's always one more crisis, one more fire to put out. That's the description of the world that animates Putinism. There is no future, only a present, and a presence in which there is always an enemy at the gate, always the possibility and probability of carnage. In Putinism, the future collapses into the present. It's an endless cycle of grave threats, calamities, and heroic victories led by a strong man who saves the nation from the ever-present threats. This worldview leads to several tenets that are important to us. The first of which is this love your neighbor stuff is for losers. There is no such thing as a neighbor. Others are either friends, temporarily useful idiots, and foes. Just as with Hitler and Goebbels in the 1930s, who saw the German church as useful idiots, useful to the extent that they could provide a fig leaf to encourage the embrace of their fascist politics. So too with Putinism, the church consists of useful idiots who can provide the facade of respectability to Putinism's excesses. Putinism doesn't see politics the way you and I see it. It's not a negotiation among neighbors to determine how we will rightly order our common lives so that all may flourish. The American way. No, because when the world consists only of friends or foes, this dualistic worldview, then the world consists of a competition to survive, a battle to survive. And when they're only friends or foes, one helps one's friends survive and one destroys one's enemies. There is no space for one's enemies in the Putinist worldview. Putinism has another self-serving tenet, and that is that for leaders, there can be no accountability. No accountability is warranted because there are always enemies at the gates, and any great failures that might happen are not due to the leader's failures, but to the chaos that has been caused by those enemies at the gates. A third tenet of Putinism is that progress towards our prosperity is never a priority nor a realistic expectation. The only realistic expectation is protection by the strong man from threats, from those enemies at the gate. Because the truth about the world is carnage as an ever-present reality. A fourth tenet of Putinism is whenever the people grow restless because there is no prosperity, think that because things that they expect are not happening, distract them by either inventing, manufacturing, or exploiting crises. We could point to numerous examples of this, but perhaps the classic one for us Americans is the propaganda that generated the idea of evil Ukrainian soldiers preparing to assault Russians that then justified the special military operation. A fifth tenet of Putinism is that truth is not a matter of facts. Truth is whatever the strong man says it is. We Americans might think that fake news is an invention by Donald Trump in his presidential campaigns, but actually fake news is a phrase that was generated by Putin and his cronies. It was a technique, a strategy. Fake news as a strategy has 3 steps. First, the Putinist politician creates the propaganda, the fake news that serve their own political purposes. In the United States, an example of that would be the claim that President Obama was an American citizen. Secondly, they then try to discredit all alternative sources of news, such that the entire institution of the press that was free is seen as no longer credible, no longer worthy of trust. And third, the Putinist declares that the only reliable source, the only valid source of information in the nation is either the strongman himself or herself, or those press institutions that are controlled by them. Just after the Berlin Wall fell, Russia had a very robust free press. Today, Russia has no free press. All of it is controlled by the Putinist regime. The 6th tenet has to do with how we signal our belongingness. In the United States, we signal our belongingness to our neighbors by baking them casseroles when they're hungry, by comforting them when they mourn, by sharing in their joys. In Putinism, there are no friends, or no neighbors, only friends and foes. And the way one signals one belongingness is by embracing the proclamations of the strong man. And that means celebrating victories when declared, experiencing and expressing outrage when demanded, and believing the lies put forth as propaganda without question. The 7th, and what I would characterize as the most corrosive of the Putinist tenets, is called the big lie. It's a page borrowed actually from Hitler. Hitler said, to tell a lie so big that your followers would never believe that you would do that to them. Russian Putinism perfected the art of the big lie and gave it its name. Perhaps the most famous example of Putin's use of that strategy is the description of the invasion of the Ukraine in order to steal its oil fields and its fertile plains as a special military operation and not a war for the purpose of defending Russian citizens. The purpose of the big lie is to bind the people together, not in a fellowship of sufferings, but in a fellowship of mendacity. The people are deluged with an avalanche of lies and fear merchandising so great that resistance is futile. And the people are reduced to subjection, bound together, not through their shared suffering, but through their shared willful ignorance. For once you bow to the big lie, you're part of a conspiracy. How are you ever freed from it? Everyone knows the lies are lies, but to name that, to say it out loud, is to name oneself an outsider and therefore an enemy. We Christians believe that we participate in God's creative power through our sacrifice of offerings in gratitude for the superabundance that God sets before us. In Putinism, one participates in the strong man's power through the sacrifice of truth. In contrast with the Putinist worldview, the world revealed by the gospel is not stuck in the present, but rather moves inexorably forward towards its fulfillment as God imagines it. Carnage is not the truth about the world. God's love is. God's presence to us, God's creative transformation of our present is the truth about the world. We Christians believe that time is going somewhere. We're not stuck in the present, but rather are moving to God's future, to a life that transcends time and space and is in perfect relationship with God as we grow into the goodness that God imagines for us. And therefore, here and now, in the present, God is active, making all things new, transforming our present, helping us to prosper, sculpting us so that we become the humans that God imagines us to be in right relationship with God and all of the wondrous creation that He has given as our context. God's decision never to be except to be with us, as Karl Barth put it, means that there is ample cause for joy, ample cause for peace between us, that we can afford to take the risk of truth speaking with each other as we break bread together in neighborly love. Brothers and sisters, what binds us together is not our sharing in some conspiracy of lies, but our sharing in the community of our sufferings as embodied by our sharing in the cup and the bread in neighborly love. And as we do that in gratitude for the superabundance that God provides, as we gaze upon the face of our neighbor, we see God's light reflected. And it shines a light on Putinism, revealing it for what it is, a big lie. And like all the big lies in history from all the strong men in history, it too will wither like the grass. Thanks be to God.